Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I'm just going to be introducing you to the linear phase EQ. A linear phase EQ is a certain type of EQ that can make changes to the frequency response of a sound while keeping the phases of the various partials of that sound the same. So it does the same job as a normal EQ plugin, but where a normal EQ can change the phases of the different frequencies in your sound, a linear phase EQ will keep those phases the same. So you can see the result of high passing using your normal mixing EQ on this kick here. And when I play this, you'll hear that both of these kicks sound the same. And that's because with the EQ, I wasn't actually filtering out any frequencies. I had the high pass set, so it was below the fundamental and it wasn't filtering out anything. So all that's happened, and you can see that the shape of the waveform has changed. And this is because using that high pass, even though I wasn't filtering out any frequencies or changing the power of any frequencies, I was shifting the phases of certain frequencies, and it just caused the waveform to change a little bit. And I'm going to demonstrate this using a saw wave. So right here I have a harmonic editor of a saw wave. And the saw wave was done using additive synthesis, and this will allow me to change the phases of the various harmonics. And watch what happens to the waveform when I do make these changes. So here's what it looks like normally. And now if I change the phase of the fundamental, you'll see that it looks pretty different. It doesn't really sound different, but the waveform looks pretty different. And that's because I haven't changed anything about the power of the fundamental. All I've done is change its phase. And you can see if I continue to change it, it will continue to make the waveform look different. Now let's look at what happens when we use an EQ to high pass this saw wave. So first off, I'm going to be using just a standard EQ, the Fruity Parametric EQ 2. And to really demonstrate how this happens, I'm going to set a pretty sharp high pass, and I won't be filtering out any of the actual frequencies. You can see that this high pass is well below the fundamental tone. And you can see with the EQ off, it looks like a nice good saw wave. But when I turn that high pass on, it will change how the waveform looks. And if I adjust the cutoff, it will keep changing how it looks. Even though I'm not actually filtering out any of the sound. And this is all happening because I'm changing the phases of certain frequencies when I do this high pass. And this will happen to some extent no matter what changes you are making using the EQ. The reason I'm using a high pass in this example is because it is the most noticeable. Now, in many cases, these phase changes from a normal EQ aren't going to cause a very big problem. So the majority of the time, while you're mixing down a track, using your normal EQ plugin will work just fine. And this is why I haven't introduced the linear phase EQ until this point of the tutorial. Because most of the time you really will be fine with just your normal EQ plugin, and linear phase EQs aren't super practical for mixing. What I personally use them for are certain things with sound design and during the mastering process. So let's look at the same saw wave using the linear phase EQ. So right now I'm using the Fruity Convolver as a linear phase EQ. And you can see if I set a high pass on the Fruity Convolver, it will be filtering out some frequencies. So if I take this below the fundamental, so it's not actually affecting the sound, you can see that the shape of the waveform remains intact. It's not affected by this high pass, where it was with the fruity parametric EQ too. And part of what really makes the linear phase EQ not very practical for mixing is because it does introduce a latency in order to maintain those phases. So when I play this with that linear phase EQ on, you should see a difference between when this note is played and when you hear it. And to give you a little bit better idea, I'm going to play a kick at the same time that this saw wave plays. So you can imagine that using a linear phase EQ on one of your sounds while you're actually mixing in the project could really mess up the timing of your song. So I don't really use a linear phase EQ while mixing, but I do use it in certain other processes that are very closely related to mixing, and some people might even consider them mixing. And the reasons I do this is because these phase shifts can sometimes cause problems between layers of a sound relating well together. So if I'm making a hardstyle kick and I have a few different layers and I want to EQ one of them, a normal EQ might cause changes to the phase relationships that cause the layer to not work properly as much anymore. And when I play it with the other layers, it doesn't create the sound that I wanted anymore. So what I would do is put a linear phase EQ on each of those, just so that the latency is the same, and then make my EQ adjustments using that linear phase EQ. And another reason is to keep the maximum amount of headroom in certain sounds when I want to high pass them. And that is something that I will take a better look at in the next video. So basically, a linear phase EQ is an EQ plugin that keeps the phases of the different frequencies in a sound the same. And while it's not particularly practical for mixing, and it would be better to use just your normal EQ in most cases, it can be very helpful in sound design and mastering.